Good afternoon and welcome back to another episode of On Brand from Muse by Clio. I'm Nicole Purcell, the president of the Clio Awards, and right next to me, wrong way, I have Mr. Tim Nutt, our editor-in-chief of Muse by Clio. How you doing, Tim?
Doing very well. Nicole, how are you?
Yes, I'm good. It's a great day. I want to send you a quick little cheers. I have a lovely wine from Sag Harbor, New York, from Wolf Estate. Very excited over.
Awesome. I have a Sebago Brewing Company. It won't surprise you. It's from Maine.
Not at all.
I'm staying on brand, so to speak, with that.
But
Cheers.
Third cheers. I am so excited for today's guest, Weedmap. Give us a little background and let's bring him in.
Yeah, we're excited to welcome today Juanjo from Weedmaps. He's the CMO over there. Weedmaps, of course, is the technology and advocacy platform for the cannabis industry. And of course, it's been a really exciting time for cannabis lately. Obviously, during the pandemic, the anti-anxiety benefits of cannabis have become quite useful to a lot of folks. We also have the Clio Cannabis Awards program over at Clio, and Weedmaps has won a couple Clios recently too. So yeah, we have lots to talk about. So I'm pleased to welcome Juanjo.
Hi, Juanjo. How are you?
Thanks for having me. I'll join in on the cheers.
Yes. Where is your beer from? We'd need to know.
It is from Oregon. It's Dead Guy Ale from Rogue Breweries.
Very cool. Well, thank you for joining us. We're so excited. The first question I'm always asking everyone, which I think you probably get it when people just call you up to see how you're doing, how is working from home, who are you living with, where are you living, how is communication with the team going, all that fun work from home stuff.
Yeah, it's actually been fascinating because I feel like we've all learned a lot about ourselves. So I'm quarantining at home in Newport Beach with my wife and our son, who turned 2 today.
Happy birthday!
And our slightly anxious dog, who may or may not start barking at any given time. We've been at home now, I think, for the better part of 4 months, and I think we've been pretty effective using, Google Hangouts and Slack primarily as a means of communication. It hasn't been without stumbles, but I think, I have to say I'm pretty proud and pretty impressed with how seamless the transition has been for much of the team. And in particular, I think for some of the marketing functions, like our creative and studio teams, where I feel like we kind of expected it to be a little bit trickier than it turned out to be. And, there were some very real issues with, things like trying to deal with really big video files while working remotely is not easy. But overall, I think it's been positive. And, I think I feel like personally I've ended up becoming sort of more productive in some ways. I've kind of found sort of a new normal, new hours to work around sort of, our son's wake up time and everything else. And so, I think it's going to be an adjustment now to get back into the office whenever that happens.
Yeah, I agree with that. For those people that don't know what Weedmaps is, can you explain that, the services, how long it's been around, and give a little overview?
Yeah, so Weedmaps, we've really been around quite a while. People tend to be surprised when you think about the legal cannabis industry. It's relatively new, but obviously medical cannabis in California has been around for 24 years. And so Weedmaps started about 12 years ago. And it originally started, as commonly known as sort of like the Yelp for cannabis, right? It was very much a way to find dispensaries and doctors. But the company has evolved very much since then. And right now, we really think of ourselves as sort of the company that wants to be the operating system for the industry, right? So we continue to have sort of our consumer offering, which is where you can either continue to find dispensaries or doctors like you would have done when the site first started, but you can also do things like place orders online, find deals, learn about strains, learn about the plant and how it might affect you. But then we have a whole suite of B2B offerings. We have, a wholesale exchange system, a point of sale system. We have the logistics functionality for people that do delivery. And obviously, sort of our core product, which is a highly targeted ad platform for cannabis advertisers, cannabis retailers and brands.
That's very interesting. Juanjo, I wanted to talk about cannabis, during the pandemic. Obviously, we've heard a lot about sort of increase in use. Could you sort of tell us what you're seeing in terms of the demand trends? And also, is there a movement more toward edibles with the concerns about vaping lately?
Yeah, so I think when the pandemic first hit and we started to see sort of some of the stay-at-home orders coming in place, it was a little bit of a nerve-wracking moment because we didn't necessarily know how a lot of the city and state regulators were going to react to how they were going to think about cannabis, right? And I think, thankfully, almost without exception, every single state and city embraced cannabis as an essential business, given sort of and many or most businesses were able to stay open. There were a few cases where they couldn't, like say, some of the dispensaries on the Strip in Vegas, because obviously they sort of did some bigger closures there. But for the most part, I think what happened is, or what we saw happen, was actually a lot of transfer of people onto platforms like Weedmaps, right? For a couple of reasons. One, because even though we didn't build our product suite with a pandemic in mind, we have been offering things like order pickups, right? So that people can do curbside delivery and stay safe, so that people can browse menus without having to go to a dispensary. And so I think in the first 4 weeks, once cities and states started to close down, we saw about a 600% increase in online orders, right? And so like about a 300% increase in deals claimed through the site. And so cannabis as a whole is actually one of the things that surprised me when I came into the industry. It's a very e-commerce friendly industry, which I wouldn't have expected. But I think, by our estimations, it varies pretty dramatically by state, but about 25% of all cannabis sales in the US happen online. Which, when you compare to retail overall being 10% or groceries being 6%, it's pretty high. And there's probably, we can talk about some of the reasons that might be driving that, but we certainly sort of have seen that sort of become even more prevalent during the pandemic. We're excited to sort of be at the forefront of helping retailers and consumers connect during this time. To your other question, in terms of some of the trends that we are seeing in terms of product consumption, is we have seen a shift towards edibles. I don't know how much of it is actually just about some of the vaping issues that happened at the end of last year. I think much of that was centered sort of on the black market more so than the legal market, and I think consumers typically make that distinction. But I think there are a couple things. One is COVID obviously being a respiratory disease. I think people have sort of tried to stay away from smoking, whether it's flower or vaping. Two is there's a lot more people that now have kids at home and don't necessarily and prefer sort of ways that are a little bit more subtle of consuming. So edibles certainly on the rise. We've seen tinctures increase as well. And so I think you have seen some shifts, and it'll be interesting to see how many of those trends sort of stay and which ones sort of like shift as things open back up.
That's right. Okay. Curious about your sort of media approach right now during the pandemic. I know it's such a interesting. The cannabis industry is really interesting in terms of there's not really any national advertising because it's not legal nationally. Yeah. So I think over the years I've noticed that you guys have done a lot of out of home, for example. But with people staying home, did your use of out of home change over the last few months, or what's that been like?
Yeah, it has. I think what I always tend to think of when I think about our media strategy is I really wish I could advertise on Weedmaps, right? Because I think the biggest challenge that we have is we really think about where can we find sort of like highly targeted audiences, because we do a lot of out of home, and you're showing some beautiful examples of our board in downtown LA, which we love, and I'll talk a little bit about. But at the end of the day, even when you do something like out of home, in sort of like some of the heavier consumption states, you're still only reaching sort of 10 to 15% of adults consume, right? And so there's a lot of sort of like wasted impressions, so to speak. And a lot of the more traditional direct response type channels just aren't available. There's a lot of, whether it's ad networks or otherwise, that are still not fully comfortable with cannabis. And so we have found some amount of sort of like pockets of success in digital advertising. There are some ad networks that are more open to cannabis, and we always sort of advertise heavily with them. But then we always sort of have the out of home play, and we have experiential plays as well, which obviously are not really functioning right now either during sort of quarantine. So from the out of home perspective, what we try to really lean into is a couple things. How do we continue to sort of like help remove the stigma of cannabis overall. So there's a part of the messaging that we do that is actually less about Weedmaps and more about cannabis as a whole and trying to normalize the consumption of cannabis. And then the other thing is just trying to make sure that people are aware of some of our new sort of functionality, right? And so I think you may have seen, I think it was last year, at the start of last year, we did sort of the Weed Facts campaign, which was this big national campaign trying to really educate people on the realities of cannabis, right? We're trying to sort of fight against 100 years of prohibition, and it's not easy because people have sort of a lot of these misperceptions about the plant. But then also in states like California, where people actually know us and are relatively aware of sort of like cannabis and its benefits, I think what we try to do is move away from that Yelp of cannabis, right? And sort of do a lot of messaging around like, hey, you can actually order on Weedmaps. You can search for brands. You can make sure that you're buying legitimate product, not counterfeit product, with our brand verified offering, and so on and so forth. So it's really we really see it sort of as a way to try to drive awareness and awareness of functionality, as opposed to sort of like more direct response, which we still do heavy digital.
So I know 420 was really, really big this year during the quarantine. And I know Weedmaps did a live stream event called Hire Together Sessions from Home. I know we have a quick clip of that. We'll see that and would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Hey there, all you cats and kittens. I'm Jared from Weedmaps.com, and welcome to Hire Together Sessions from Home.
Hey, this is Mike Tyson, and I'm here to say happy 420.
It's 420, and we are getting high.
Today, along with Weedmaps, we're going to be discussing tea. There you go. Picture's ready to go.
Welcome to the Herbal Healing Session.
I mean, first of all, Mike Tyson, that does it all. And I think we have a longer clip and that'll come back on, but how did that work and who did you feature and what kind of engagement did you get from that?
Yeah, so, 420, 420 was always expected to be huge this year because it was 420 for the full month, right? It was, being 2020, it was sort of like 30 days of 420, and I think the entire industry was waiting for it. Then obviously when COVID hit at the end of March, it was like, well, a lot of what we had planned is not going to happen, right? So we were actually planning on doing a lot of field activation in a lot of sort of big cities. So we were going to be the presenting sponsor for Hippie Hill in San Francisco, which is, sort of like the big celebration in Northern California, and in a few other different sort of planned events around the country. And I was so impressed by the team being able to just pull together sort of a live stream in 5 weeks, from contracting to everything. So the idea was really to try to give people a place where they could celebrate safely. Some of it was actually in conversations with groups like the group that does Hippie Hill in San Francisco, where the city of San Francisco was very worried that people were still going to show up to the park to smoke, even though they were trying to sort of create social distancing. So we said, is there anything we can do to give people a reason to stay home, right? And so we worked to sort of create this event, super impressed with the names that the team was able to bring together. We had, obviously, you saw Mike Tyson, we had Wiz Khalifa, we had Burner, we had Billy Ray Cyrus. We try to cover all of the 420 moments across the continental US. So we started sort of for East Coast time and worked our way all the way through the West Coast. We had chefs doing little cooking segments, and we had music, and we had a lot, other people just sort of talking about cannabis. And so it was honestly just a reason for people to be online as opposed to being outside. We made it easy for you to order online while you were watching and get cannabis delivered. And it blew away our expectations. We'd been seeing at that time that a lot of people were trying to shift to online and live streams, and we didn't really know what to expect. Our audience is obviously a lot smaller than some of these bigger players, but we had north of 250,000 people tune into the live stream, right, which we didn't expect. And then the other component is, well, are they just going to tune in and just watch and not do anything? But I think from the 250,000 viewers, we had something like 15,000 orders happen directly from people viewing, right? So it really turned into sort of like a very transactional thing. And that was a big part of the way we set it up as well, was we didn't just want to have a concert, but we wanted to work with the partners that we had planned on doing 420 events with. So we gave them ad space that would show, next to the video so that people could place orders. And it was all regional so that, if somebody was dialing in from a region that doesn't allow commercial cannabis, we wouldn't show any ads. If somebody was dialing from a particular region, we saw a retailer that could serve them specifically.
Such a great idea. Amazing what you guys built there. Last year, as you know, we launched Clio Cannabis Awards, which was very exciting, very proud to start that. And you guys took home 2 Clios for the Museum of Weed. And I think we have a quick clip of that as well right now.
Great.
What do you think of the reproduction that we've done?
It really feels like you're in the room, especially as it fills up with people. We had all the basic infrastructure, the bulletin boards, the decorating, the origami, flying birds, but it was really about the people. We had a problem. We had the AIDS crises. A lot of people were harmed. The medical pot was really helping, and the problem was distributing it. There was only a few of us. We were doing it to get arrested, so it wasn't a popular thing to be doing. And we thought that if we could legalize the sales of pot, then everybody would be able to go buy it. And so the media loved it. They could come in there and film illegal transactions, and all we asked them to do was talk to the patients on either side of the counter, ask them, why are you doing this? Those stories went out, and those journalists told the story of cannabis and various medical conditions. And a lot of people tuned in and started saying, maybe that works for me. Well, that was what happened every day at the Cannabis Club. People were smoking joints and talking to each other and forming friendships and finding reasons to live. And a lot of those people are alive today because of that.
Congratulations again. Experiential is so important. I hate that we don't have it right now, but why is it so important for the cannabis industry? And how did that help you?
Yeah, I think experiential is extremely important for the cannabis industry, I think for a couple of reasons. One, sort of practical, which is there's so many other forms of advertising that aren't available to the cannabis industry. And so experiential is one of the ones where you can be most creative and sort of bring new things to the table. And the second reason I'd say is that there's so many people that still want to learn about cannabis, and it's so much harder to try to learn in a sort of digital media where you don't have that interaction, right? So many people are intimidated or don't know what to ask. And so experiential is super important to get people comfortable, normalize the consumption of flower and the consumption of the plant. And so it's always been a core pillar of, I think, any marketing strategy that I've seen in cannabis. I think specifically when it comes to the museum and some of the things that we try to do as a brand as well is we really see sort of a responsibility associated with sort of our position as one of the longest standings and bigger players in the industry of, putting our money where our mouth is in terms of moving the industry forward, right? So doing things like the museum, which was certainly not sort of an activity that was done with commercial intent, right? We very much wanted to do it so that people could come and learn about the history of the plant. We wanted people to be able to use the space for events. So we had an event where we invited a lot of the social equity business owners in LA to talk about the state of social equity in cannabis, and we brought regulators in as well. We did a event with some of our partners in the veterans organizations to talk about the importance of helping veterans get access to cannabis. We did an event around the history of weed and the LGBTQ population and how sort of weed played such a big role during the AIDS epidemic with its therapeutic sort of aspects. And it was really about how do we tell that story. And I think experiential is, again, a really powerful way to do that. We had exhibits in the museum where people could hear recordings of people who are currently in prison for nonviolent drug offenses. And if you walked through, you could see people really understanding some of the issues with the war on drugs and the history of cannabis in a much more real way than you could ever achieve through a non-sort of physical medium.
Yeah. I'm curious about if you could talk a little more about the advocacy angle. I think it's so important in the cannabis industry, whether you're talking about past injustices or you're talking about sort of working to legalize now. It's been a focus of a lot of your ads over the years, and clearly that was a big element of the Museum of Weed as well. How much progress are you guys making in terms of advocacy?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I'd say, sort of to go back on something I just mentioned is I think it's a core part of who we are, right? If you look at sort of like our company mission, it's to power a transparent and inclusive global cannabis economy, right? And we're very deliberate about having inclusive be a part of that. When you look sort of historically at what's happened with cannabis, both from sort of like just general legalization, but then with how it's being used to target underprivileged communities, there's just a lot of wrongs that I think society and regulators are moving towards trying to right, but it's so far not being super successful, right? I think there's been a lot of challenges in the way that legalization has happened. In fact, this is we haven't talked about this publicly yet, so it's the first time I'll be mentioning it, but in a few weeks, we hope to be releasing a 3-part docuseries that we've been working that highlights sort of what's happened with legalization in California, right? I think when you think about California had a thriving market for 20 years under Prop 215, and most people, when they voted to legalize recreational marijuana, expected that would make access easier and make it easier for people to sort of like consume the plant and get the medicine that they need. In reality, what's happened is that access has gone way down and prices have gone way up, right? Making accessibility trend in the wrong direction than what I think voters wanted. And so we really wanted to help people understand why that happened and what the path forward may look like. And so, we really think that, again, going back to, if we're a big player in the space, we can't just benefit from the industry that's been put in place, but we have to give back. And so, everything from, we have a social equity program, which, we've talked about in the past, where we provide access and benefits to social equity business owners to get, there's a filter on our maps where you can look at, if you want to shop only based on businesses, retailers that have gotten a social equity license, you can. We partner with Can-Inclusive to have a list on our site of all retailers that are Black owned, both on the brands, the delivery, and the dispensary side. We have resources that we offer them. And then we also do things like partner with groups like Weed for Warriors or the Last Prisoner Project to try to work on the criminal justice side of things as well. And so that's, it's a core part of who we are, and I think what we want to spend our time on. I think the other aspect of advocacy is also just driving legalization, right? And so we have a great, very effective government relations team that works in any given time is sort of working across different states, not only just to try to drive legalization, but to drive the right kind of legalization. Because I think that's been one of the big sticking points. If you see sort of like the regulatory landscape in different markets right now in the US, it's vastly different. You have markets that are essentially where you can only come in if you have millions and millions of dollars to set up a company, because they have requirements like you have to be fully vertically integrated. So you have to be able to afford doing cultivation, manufacturing, retail, and the number of licenses is very finite, to other states that are much more liberal, and I think they create a very different kind of market. So I think one of my favorite sort of random tidbits on that is, I don't think anybody would have expected that the most inclusive cannabis market in the US is Oklahoma. But it is, right, where there's more sort of like minority ownership of businesses, and it's because they've taken one of the most liberal approaches to access and to sort of like the ability for people to get licenses.
Interesting. Jumping off that, I was thinking about your marketing strategy. I have to say, I don't envy you as a CMO having to, different states have different, all kinds of different legality issues.
Mm-hmm.
How do you even go about sort of dealing with developing a strategy that will work sort of all around the country? Or do you really have to spend time going state by state? And also, how do you balance medicinal versus recreational? I mean, there's so many moving parts, it seems like, in your job. Can you sort of explain how you handle all that?
Yeah, so the short answer is that it takes a lot of work. So we very much do sort of have state-by-state strategies. We do have some national campaigns, but for the most part, going back to sort of the concept of lost impressions, many of our national campaigns have a lot of lost impressions, right? Particularly if we want to do things that are more sort of like transactional in nature. And so we tend to do, more of the advocacy things at sort of like at the national level. But when it comes to the way that we build sort of our marketing plan, first, it all starts with a very thorough legal team that keeps us from making any missteps, right? Because some of the regulations are extremely sort of like detailed and specific, right? And so we have states where any creative we want to run has to be presented to regulators, and they have to approve it before we can run it, right? When you think of a world in which we all run digital advertising and you want to be optimizing and changing ads every day, when suddenly any copy or image change you have to do has to go to a regulator and you have to wait 2 weeks for approval, it very much sort of changes the nature of what you can do and how you can execute. But really, I think at the core of what we try to do is we spend time with the communities, the cannabis communities in the different regions, right? Partly because legalization has happened in such a heterogeneous way, I think the industries are very different. You have some markets that are very price sensitive, and others that focus very much on maybe particular strains or sort of like quality of product or product types. And so what we try to do is try to go into markets in a very real and organic way where we become a part of the community. So, just in the last week, I've probably spent 4 or 5 hours talking to cannabis influencers in a particular state that we want to go into, right? To really understand how does the cannabis community work in your area? Because sometimes it's not even at the state level, right? There's sort of like microcosms within that. And how can we show up in a way that's very natural and organic? And that takes a lot of time. And it's part of the reason that, if you look at sort of like our performance state by state, it's very different. There's states that we started working on a few years ago, and we're in a very good place. We have states where I'll give you this stat that we try to do some back of the envelope math. In California, we think that about 50% of all cannabis transactions sort of like have some kind of attribution to Weedmaps, right? Which is huge. And in other states, we just have very high penetration among cannabis consumers. And I think eventually we want to make our way sort of down the list of other states. But inevitably, because my team is it's relatively large, but it's finite, we can't try to bite everything off at once. And so it takes sort of very deliberate effort around understanding the differences and the nuances in these markets.
I feel like you're doing all the work for all the new cannabis companies that are coming out and are going to have to do some marketing. So that's amazing. That's a lot. You also do a lot of content marketing with Weedmaps News. Tell us what you're doing there and what are you putting out news-wise? That's a daily, correct?
Yeah.
News.
So I think our content play, I think I'd say, has evolved over the years. Weedmaps News originally started very much with the intent to be, what it's called, to be news, which was, I think what we found is that, number one, I don't know how much appetite there truly is for pure sort of news. And number two, I think the maturity of understanding of cannabis is such that there were other areas of content that we could play a bigger role in. So we kind of pivoted news to be more around learning content and educational content that's still sort of like current to the times, but that's not necessarily real-time type information, right? So we have, we'll do a lot of talking to celebrities or influencers and talking about how they're consuming products, trying to highlight differences in how people are cultivating cannabis, trying to make sure that we can surface some of those differences by region, right? If there's a particular type of product that is really trending in a particular state, let's talk about it. What makes it different? What discoveries have happened on the sort of research side that consumers might want to know? And it's really around sort of like trying to fill that gap that I think exists from partly from the complete lack of information that existing during Prohibition, and now sort of still the gap that exists from people still being afraid to ask, right? I think a lot of times when it comes to cannabis, it almost feels like, we all sort of regress a little bit to our college selves, where you feel kind of like shy or dumb to ask about, like, oh, I don't know how to do that, because you feel like, at some point you should have learned. But the reality is, number one, like the industry is just moving so fast, and then there's so much that none of us know that it's okay to ask for, and we kind of want to normalize the learning process of cannabis as well.
That's so interesting. We're going to jump to your past for a little bit. I know you've been at Adobe and Instacart and Google. What have you taken from those, all creative companies, by the way, amazing companies. What have you taken from them to bring into Weedmaps, and has it helped you?
Yeah, so, I think one thing that I'll say about my sort of like path to becoming a CMO is that it's probably pretty non-traditional. I spent a lot of time doing non-marketing work, doing sort of like operations and sales work as well. But I think the common thread that I think my career has had is being trying to solve challenging problems, right? So on the operations side, they tend to be problems around scale. And then on the marketing side, taking challenges like, when I was at Adobe, my big focus was how do you drive engagement and retention, which Adobe is a phenomenal company, but you're basically trying to take, what is basically 30-year-old consumers or 30-year-old sort of legacy processes for consumer marketing and convert them into what people are trying to do today. But you're doing it off of, pretty monolithic, huge software that doesn't work in a very modern way. And so it presents sort of like a lot of interesting challenges. I think what I've generally taken from most of those places, though, is the willingness to try things and fail, and then try something else, right? I think certainly sort of like Google and Instacart very much had that ethos of just, let's throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, and if it doesn't work, let's make another batch and have another run at it. I think Adobe was a little bit slower moving than that, but I think they had a lot of the same sentiment of wanting to try and sort of like break the status quo and do things a little bit differently. And I think that's very much what I've been trying to do with my team here, right? Really sort of like question the reasons we've been doing things before, and then use sort of like all the restrictions that existed in cannabis advertising to see what opportunities that presents, right? Like how can those restrictions will inevitably breed creativity, right? And like how can we sort of get creative around what are the solutions that we want to try, and how do we know what's going to work and what's not going to work, right? Like let's just keep trying until something works.
Juanjo, last question for you. I know it's difficult to predict anything right now, but if you had to look at the next sort of 6 to 12 months at Weedmaps, where do you think you're heading next? And also, what are you sort of most hopeful for personally as we kind of proceed through the COVID crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think, personally, what I'm most hopeful for is a vaccine, therapeutics, the people that are getting sick sort of are able to get better, and that we're all able to sort of like return to normalcy slowly and safely. When it comes to Weedmaps and sort of more generally, I think there's a couple things that I'm particularly excited about. One is there's about, I think, 6 or 7 states that have some form of cannabis legalization on the ballot in November. So we're very much looking forward to how those turn out. I think in general, nationally, we've seen huge support shifting towards legalization, and obviously, we want to continue to do our part in that. And then the second piece is I'm really excited to really start to talk more and put out more of the work that we've been doing around advocacy more front and center, right? I feel like there's a lot of work that we've done or that we are doing actively that we choose not to talk about. And this is a conversation that we've had a lot with some of our partners on the advocacy side, right? Because I think we've taken very much a stance of we want to do the work and let the work speak for itself before we speak about the work, right? So I think we're getting to a point where we have there's enough credibility behind the work we're doing, and there's enough stories to tell that we want to start telling those stories, right? And make sure that it's clear that what we're doing is what we care about is the output and not the marketing around it, right? So I really want us to be able to start telling those stories and having people understand the industry in sort of like another layer of depth, right? Which is more about what are the real challenges that are happening in cannabis? Because I think there's this pretty big misconception, I think, that when cannabis got legalized in some of these states, everybody who was in the industry was going to become a billionaire, right? There's green rushers coming in and everything was going to get better. And the reality is that that's not what's happening today, right? And I think there's a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot of certainly a lot of good that can come of it. But I think we all still need to take a hard look at the way in which we're doing things in the industry to make it all better for everybody that's involved, and everybody that, the legalization in most states made a promise to right the wrongs of the war on drugs and what it actually means to do that.
Awesome. Juanjo, thank you so much for your time today. This was so interesting. I want to wish you good luck in Clio Cannabis Awards this year. We hope we see some more wins from you. And we support the industry professionally and personally. So thank you so much again for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Did you laugh at my professionally and personally side, Tim? Sometimes you have to have a good night's sleep. That's all I'm going to say. But that was really, really interesting, and I learned actually so much. So
yeah, I don't know if there's an industry out there that's more complicated right now for marketers.
Yeah,
so it's interesting to hear what they're doing.
And we get to see it in the jury room, which is so fun, and see the great work coming out and how they're learning more. So have a great afternoon.
Here's you too. All right, that's it for us this week. Thanks for watching. For daily coverage of creativity, please visit musebiclio.com every day. And we're back every Thursday at 4 with a new episode of On Brand. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.